Good morning or good afternoon. We are smack in between 12:05. And we will continue today with Hans Ruin, The Passivity of Reason, on Heidegger's concept of Stimmung. And we are presently at page 145. Second paragraph, where we left off at 1462. And we have been talking about the different term for passion. Are they all sort of connect to passivity or the receiving end? I also like the term being a result of, where you sort of have no choice. Affectus is my favorite term. A thing getting affected. This, of course, doesn't imply that passion is not strong, not violent, but it points to it being secondary in the causal chain. Not deciding what happens. So I start. This organization of reason and passion in terms of activity and passivity also regulates the most detailed Aristotelian account of the passions. That which we find not in his ethics, nor in his doctrine of the soul. But in rhetoric. In this work, passion, pathos, is defined as that through which men are led to change their opinions. Beside logical and dialectical skills, the art of rhetoric involves a knowledge of what the basic passions are, under what circumstances they appear, and how they can be brought about. Aristotle himself is explicitly torn in his treatment of this theme. He recognizes that generating passions and putting the listeners into certain frames of mind are essential qualities of a good speaker. At the same time, it is repeatedly stated that it is wrong to try to convince only by these means. For those whose minds are clouded by emotions are unable to see the truth and to judge properly. This last sentence is everything in a nutshell. For those whose minds are clouded by emotions are unable to see the truth and to judge properly. Or lead the judges or listeners to the appropriate emotion. It is only when the facts have been properly stated in the very kernel of Western thinking, I would say. In rhetoric, the analysis is pursued strictly with regard to its practical use for the orator. yet it constitutes a very precise attempt to define analytically the nature of passions in terms of the mental predisposition, the object, and the situation of the emotion in question. So, e.g., fear, phobos, is defined as a painful or trouble imaging of a precipitating, destructive, or painful evil. In sum, Aristotle's treatise demonstrates a very clear philosophical grasp of the passions. Not only in terms of the structure and organization, but also of the role they play in the overall orientation of man in the world. He even suggests in the famous passage from the first book of metaphysics that philosophy itself begins in a certain qualified passion, namely wonder, Thomasein. Yet, throughout his writings on this topic, the basic dichotomy remains, according to which the passivity inherent in passion should be cultivated and brought under control by activity, energia. The highest expression of which is reason, nous, as practiced in philosophical wisdom. This is spelled out in particular in the discussion of wisdom, theoretical contemplation, and happiness in the last book of the Nicomachean Ethics. The practice of wisdom in thinking is the highest good. Precisely because it is the most active and self-sufficient among the virtues. So what is done here is an evidential parting in the eyes of Aristotle himself. He is engaged in an activity that he would term division or clearing out the differences. Very important to remember that when we go deeper into the text. This is how Aristotle perceived it. Something put under destruction by Heidegger. This supposedly classic organization of reason and passion can also be illustrated with another ethic from another era, namely that of Spinoza. His Ethica is a work whose central goal is precisely to pave the way for a mastery of the passions, or the affects by means of reason. Spinoza, in fact, goes further than Aristotle in that he does not divide the soul into passive and active principles. Instead, he describes a closed system of effects of a greater or smaller degree of activity. An effect can only be replaced by another effect, if yet of a more active nature. At the outset of the fourth book of his Ethica, Spinoza states that the inability of man to control and suppress the affects I call his servitude. Swedish, we have a saying, ord och inga visor. This is pretty grave. to absorb the passivity of the passions into the activity of reason. That is the classic trope that organizes the relation between these two human faculties. And I think this is also highly indicative, in my view, that this is larger than both Aristotle and Spinoza. It is at the very, very base of Western thinking. In other words, passions are not something that classic reason neglects. But something in respect to which it defines the philosophical struggle as such. Very important. This is the philosophical struggle. Nothing else, I would even add. The same attitude animates Descartes. The passions of the soul, composed a few decades earlier. The underlying motivation behind this work, which is a very detailed description of the various passions interwoven with his theory of body and soul. is to describe the most appropriate relation to the passions, which again is one of strict control. The argument presented so far is based on the Greek heritage, in which the dichotomy between passivity and activity organizes the philosophical treatises on the passions and their relation to reason, thinking, and knowledge. However, in order to correctly assess the transformations of this paradigm, which can be discerned in certain strands of modern thinking, we also need to briefly review the parallel and partly contradicting views on this constellation as it comes forth in the Christian tradition. According to Paul, the flesh and the spirit are strictly separated and hierarchically organized. but not in virtue of the former's passivity, but rather, as he writes in Romans 8:6, in virtue of the fact that the flesh is disobedient to God, whereas the spirit is obedient, or at least can choose to be obedient. In other words, it can choose to submit itself to that higher reason which is the divinity. Perhaps the most forceful expression of the Greek, anti-Greek nature of Paul's teaching is found in the Corinthians 1. In which the Greeks are defined precisely as those who aspire to wisdom, Sophia. A wisdom God has supposedly, intentionally humiliated by uplifting what appears to be foolish. In the same letter, he describes his own teaching as one not brought forth by words of wisdom, but by a demonstration of spirit and force. The underlying presupposition of this rhetoric is the idea that the highest insight comes not through learning or wisdom, but through salvation. That is, through a qualified submission of the spirit with regard to a supreme force. I would say this goes to the very core of what is the Heideggerian amnesia. And taking Spinoza and Descartes as examples could be expanded to the entirety of the Western philosophical tradition. So Heidegger is into something no other philosopher has pointed out. The presumed division turned out not to be a division. Much later, in the division that we thought existed, became obliterated by the early 20th century. We are confusing what is underneath as something that originates everything. The soul pushes the human into higher thinking. It is prima causa. Very often is called clearness. The enlightened mind or a description I am not so happy with, rationality itself. And in this spectrum, the other part, the secondary part, often called emotions or affects, pathos, is an almost corrupted original pure essence. And are we to have Sophia, knowledge, we will have to go to the origin, not the secondary, passive, affect. often this logos in different philosophies is seen as higher, but also much more forceful. It demands, it decides. It becomes the driving force of revolutions later on. And it feeds its substratum, its nurture, its manure, is the idea or the sensation, the mistaken sensation of a divisibility, that you can divide and get two parts. And this is, in parenthesis, which I will not delve into today, the Seinsfrage. The forgotten question. The telos. And since that archaic forgetfulness, the fight on the surface has become that one between the two presumed divisions, ratio or logos and pathos. And usually the logos side is the preferred one, but it can also be a reversible feature, as in the Romantics. I will take a short pause and have a summary on the whiteboard. So, the passivity is a tough nut to crack. In the history of philosophy, it sometimes looks as active, and then it looks as passive. It changes its appearance, and that makes the amnesia harder to follow. Heidegger manages, he stays clear of using the customary wordings of philosophy, and thereby avoiding subject-object with terms like Dasein and Stimmung. One way of approaching it is to see it as an originary mistake or a mistaken belief. And how this mistaken belief gets its own force, its own explanation for its existence. This is very close to what we mentioned many times before, the relationship, the simultaneous coming to the world of initial conditions and classical laws. They are co-constructive. A simpler example that might illustrate this, still tough, is the idea of perception, experience itself. And an ongoing misconception that one is first, more originary, and something else lingers about as secondary. Since we're talking about Paul, why not use a cross? If I fill in these sides, we have, and let me play out this monopoly game of perception, original, first cause, and description of perception, or emotion if you like. This could be a white cross, but it can also be a black cross. In this image, there is no way of telling what is the true perception. There will always be at least two. So the idea, which is broader and more encompassing than an idea, is in some way deeply paradoxical. And this is an important point by Heidegger. Since the misconception or the amnesia only feeds on the grounds of a division being possible, one being first, the other second. one being more central, clearer. Often is the idea that the object is clearer, whereas my perception of it could be wrong because of lack of vision or lack of clarity and perfection. The same game is playing out with logos and pathos. Often, not always, but often the logos take the part of an object that cannot be, so to speak, misconceived or misperceived. And thereby this almost wholly essential object is truer. Is more originary, and it is what causes, and this is important, this is what causes pathos. And pathos often, not always, is a versant version of the logos, ideation. And this is the same game that goes on here to the very point. This can be approached in different ways, and the Heideggerian way is to take in the archaeology of thinking itself, the whole development. This is something that helps that understanding. And often, and until recently, it was called, even in the sciences of neurology and the science of cognition, was called just perceiving. I'm taking out the just mostly. But once we went deeper into this, which happened very recently in neurology, we came into some grave problems. We came to an understanding that perception is not one singular thing. And I can comment myself on this cross. If you never met upon Christianity, is it certain that you will recognize the cross, perceive it? It is highly unlikely. But we think, and as of course Spinoza and even more so Aristotle thought, that it simply is out there for us to take in. This is exactly the point of Thomas Nagel in The Perspective from Nowhere. This oversimplification is deceitful. And so is the possibility of a division between logos and pathos. It is just the possibility that nurtures its existence, which is the very core, what it needs to be there. Trying to choose one or the other will not help to get in to the core of the thing. This paradoxality also is something that science met upon in the 1920s, where we realized that the observer is not nowhere or a secondary thing to the empirical object out there, unattached, looking like rationality, logos. And of course, quantum physics did not choose the other end. It showed that the division itself does not make any sense. And therefore they merged directly, because they were never separable. I hope that helps. My colleague Kalle maybe want to add some comments.
Let's see here. I put it there.
Hello. Let me repeat from this paper, Passivity of Reason by Hans Ruin. On page 146, Hans Ruin writes, referring to Aristotle. He, that is Aristotle, suggests in the famous passage from the first book of metaphysics, the philosophy itself begins in a certain qualified passion, namely wonder, thaumatsei. And this idea, we found it also in Plato, actually, that the philosophy begins with this thaumatsei, wonder. And Heidegger also has discussed this many times, and he agrees with this assumption. But the thing is, what is really thaumatsei? So Hans Ruin continues here, yet throughout his writings, that is Aristotle's writings on this topic, the basic dichotomy remains, according to which the passivity, inherent in passion, should be cultivated and brought under control by activity, etc. etc. So Hans Ruin, Aristotle says that philosophy itself begins in a certain qualified passion, namely wonder, thaumatsei. Question is thaumatsei really a passion? Let us perhaps you have a similar the thaumatology, and that means study of miracles, for instance. And Sauma, you can compare it with Thea. The etymology comes from Thea, and doesn't have anything to do with the Theos, God. No, it doesn't have. It means sight. That is, you have the same word. Also, theater. Theater is a place where you see. So Sauma, in Taumatsen, comes from to see. That means Taumatses could be also something that, okay, does it mean to wander, or does it mean to see? Etymologically speaking, it might see. So the philosophy perhaps begins not with wonder, but with seeing. If we take Aristotle and Plato in the etymological sense of Taumatsen. So wonder, and then where would you put Taumatsen, or the origin of philosophy? Would you put it in passion or in reason, so to say? Perhaps it's in both camps. Normally we associate seeing with reason, but it's an interesting target of me to think where do you place Taumatsen in seeing, and Greeks were fixated with seeing, as we know. That's interesting. But I will not enter to that. I will only give you some food for thought if you want to add something.
Yes, very good. Well, I would say seeing, as often called in English, is believing. And this is very close to this because you see it. And therefore it's out there. True, original. I am secondary as a seer, perceiver, or receiver. And this is, of course, not limited to the idea of perception or neurology. It goes deep into our thinking, and it's the main core in physics, the absolute main core of physics. So Thea is very good color. Thank you for that one. Because all of the classical mode is about seeing. And me as seeing the world, taking it in like this, and all the different solutions. Could you mention Plato and Aristotle, because they went, as we usually see, separate ways. This way of seeing them tells us they didn't go separate ways. They express themselves differently from the same original amnesia. Great, thank you very much, Kalle, and thank you for your patience. This was a rather complicated paper. Bye-bye.
Thank you.